an edited volume, English Studies in India, Contemporary and Evolving Paradigms, and an English translation of the Hindi novel Labanya Devi, for which he was awarded a PEN America Translation Grant in 2021. I would now invite Professor Mahanta to take over the session.
Thank you, Aditi. I hope I'm audible.
Yes, you're audible.
Right. So, welcome to the technical session for today. And the session is titled Disability and Performance. I guess we have 4 presenters for the session, and all 4 are here. So, given that we have around 120 minutes and 4 presenters, organizers, is 20 minutes reasonable for all the presenters, or can we go up to 25?
I believe 20 is what we decided. So maybe
20.
around,
Okay.
20 is fine.
Okay, so we have 20 minutes for each presenter, a liberal 20 minutes, not a strict 20 minutes. Okay. And at the end of it, I think we'll have enough time for taking up a few questions and answers. So just very briefly, to begin, we are into the 3rd day already. So summarizing things doesn't make, doesn't need to be done too much. So very briefly, we are exploring the very complex phenomenon of resistance, which, any attempt to summarize is invariably leads to putting oneself at risk, and also to simplifying issues to the extent that nuances are lost. However, what we are basically, and where we come in to this idea of disability and performance is, whenever we define resistance, we do it in terms of the act and opposition to it. Okay, action and opposition to action. And, it is in this broadest sense where active behavior is undertaken in opposition to something that we define action. And opposition is the resistance to someone or something that is unjust or unfair. Okay. So it is this broad range of behaviors, this continuum of behaviors, which, bring in both these terms, the action and the opposition, that we think that most of the papers today are going to address. With this brief note, we just get on with the presentations. The first performance, the first paper for today is titled Dancers with Disability, Choreographing New Movement Definitions in Indian Dance Forms, which is to be presented by Suman Bhagchandani. Suman is a PhD scholar in the Department of English, Jamia Millia Islamia, guest faculty in Maitrey College, University of Delhi, and her research concerns itself with the study of body of the Kathak dancer as the site for cultural articulation and its negotiations with definitive and normative ways of reception. So I guess this presentation is a part of the larger research that she is undertaking. Over to you, Suman. We are starting at around 4:40, roughly.
Thank you so much, sir. And thank you to all the organizers for giving me this platform to present my ideas. The title is slightly reframed as Dancers with Disability, Making Meaning Through Movement and Training the Body. There's a slight variation there. Without further ado, I'll anyway start. The work starts with saying that how the Hindu mythology and the Indian classical dance tradition reads Brahma as someone who instructed Bharata Muni in the fine art of storytelling and performance, and of the different styles of storytelling, including drama and music, that finds its mention in the Natya Shastra. Classical dance is also read alongside as a storytelling form. Drawing its inspiration from Shiva's movements, Bharata Muni created a binary idea of dance as Tandav and Lasya, In order to seek a guiding presence, apsaras were created from cloud and water as semi-divine figures, also known as vidyadharis or embodiments of knowledge, who were entrusted with the art of performance. An evidence of these celestial figures descending to earth and instructing mortals in the fine art of movement can be found in the temple architectures of the country. The temple sculptures and its influence on dance can be explored by various dance scholars have been explored by various dance scholars like Kapila Vatsayan in Indian classical dance from 1974 to a more recent Urmi Mala Sarkar Munshi's work, The Noted Steps Recontextualizing Female Subjectivity, which was a lecture that she delivered in 2015 at Zakir Hussain College. The two differ starkly in their approach, as Vatsayan's work relies on understanding the derivation of Indian classical dance from temple sculptures, while Sarkar Munshi's work questions the same overpowering influence of these monolithic structures of cultural interpretation. According to Vatsayan, the sculptures encapsulate the idea of beauty and perfection, and according to her, the movement should ideally transcend the temporality of the performer and conjure the figure that is self-like in its appearance. Using the same reference point for her argument, Sarkar Munshi inverts this culturally approved hegemonic presence of temple sculptures that over the years have influenced and shaped the idea of a perfected appearance of a female dancer. Sarkar Munshi questions the silhouetted presence of temple sculptures under whose shadows the dancers in Khajuraho and Konark festivals are annually expected to perform. She believes the judicial gaze of the historically approved Apsara-like bodies of ancient dancers manifests an indefinite sight of comparison and amendment for the temporal performers on stage. According to the Natya Shastra, sublime beauty, which is one of the central attributes of performing artists, is both the composition of physical features and must be projected through gestural movements that have been culturally approved by stalwarts of dance. This is further encouraged by an unquestioned reliance on texts like the Abhinay Darpan, which reiterate an ableist narrative of who can occupy the proscenium and how. Further, as cultural performances underwent several stages of formalization, the body of the performer also increasingly became inscribed with codified meanings. Chakravarti and Khokar's works annotate this shift to mid-20th century development in cultural nationalism, which aimed at regulating the performance style of Indian classical dance. Referring to the contribution of Maya Rao in standardizing mudras in Kathak, the two highlight the significant shift in institutionalization of dance that was a direct result of print media. One of the examples in this direction is Rao's article titled The Hastas in Kathak, which look at different hast mudras or the meaning of hand movements vis-a-vis the postured body. For instance, I quote Rao over here. She says that if the dancer intends to represent the moon, not only will his or her hands show the Ardh Chandra Hasta, but his body will also bend in an arc to suggest the idea of the crescent moon. Unquote. Consequently, what happens through these repeated performances and incremental influence of print media, advocating the same through performances, is the construction of a collective social memory of the nation. According to Paul Connerton, this collective memory is constructed and legitimated by two activities repeatedly performed, that is, commemorative practices and bodily performances. The work looks at the manifestation of social memory as emerging from, I quote, commemorative ceremonies that prove to be commemorative only insofar as they are performative, and performativity cannot be thought without a concept of habit, and habit cannot be thought without a notion of bodily automatisms, unquote. Further, Connerton explores this performative aspect of rituals, which is a formalized language, performative in nature, and may or may not necessarily attempt to diagnose the meaning behind the performance. What happens consequently, as the work suggests, is a systematic construction of a ritualistic language, which survives through the process of reenactment. Therefore, if we bring together the ritualistic display of the body performative in classical Indian dance and received gestural messages coded in cultural language, we observe construction of a discourse which is essentially ableist in its tone. That is, through a continually repeated performance style, a movement vocabulary is established which overlooks the absence of alternate presences that could possibly participate in the writing of the cultural narrative. Anne Albright, in her work Strategic Abilities, Negotiating the Disabled Body in Dance, foregrounds this fear that lies at the core of classical performances, which rely on the idea of an able-bodied presence on stage and refuse to acknowledge a conceivable existence of non-classical bodies. I quote, "Based as it is in the live body, dance contains the cultural anxiety that the grotesque will erupt unexpectedly through the image of the classical body, shattering the illusion of ease and grace by the disruptive presence of fleshly experience, heavy breathing, sweat, technical mistakes, physical injury, even evidence of a dancer's age or mortality." Unquote. However, this perhaps is still a less visibly challenging presence to the effortless performance given by the able-bodied dancers. And so in order to understand the sparse presence of people with medical disability who occupy the proscenium and the manner in which they apparently threaten the seamless kinesthetics of performance, we need to look beyond the systematic ensemble that the performing arts tradition has become. One of the causes for the genesis of this pervasive discrimination can also be associated with Indian philosophical texts that legitimate corporeal and intellectual hierarchy and the impact it has had in shaping social views. Dr. Karna's work in this context is an extensive study of structural discrimination meted out to people with disability that are almost always subjected to either pity or philanthropy or a complete ostracization from the society. He refers to the term karma phal, which according to the Hindu doctrine associates disability to sins of the past and gauges the two against each other as directly proportional in nature. The chapter titled Disability and the Indian Scenario elaborates on quotidian activities from which people with disabilities have been distanced based on the belief that even their shadow is an extension of the evilness that they carry from the previous birth. Hence, when we talk about dance, it only seems comprehensible how and why people with disability were discriminated against and deprived of the proscenium, reserving the apparently sanctimonious, for the physically abled and the spiritually sanitized performers. However, it is not as if there has been a complete absence of dancers with disability in the Indian classical dance tradition. In fact, there have been minor tectonic shifts in the way dancers with disability started to occupy the proscenium, expanding the scope for inclusive space in pedagogy and performance. A great influence in this shift in perception towards dancers with disability comes from the awareness of the rights and movements for the implementation, which began sometime around 1960s and gained momentum and recognition in the coming years. At this point, I will take a brief diversion to look at the case of Sudha Chandran that Vimal C. evaluates through the lens of disability and representation. Vimal's work aims to critique the imposed norms of ability that the Bharatanatyam dancer internalized to an extent that her career was as much about performing the art form as it was about concealing her prosthetic leg. The work foregrounds Chandran's crafty attempt to erase the perceptible difference between ability and disability by practicing perfection of movement and surpassing the identity medically imposed on her. One of the performance styles adopted by Chandran, as the essay rightly points out, is a shift in focus from movement of the limbs to facial expressions, thus exploiting the potential of those body parts that fall within the bracket of ableness. It may be then right to question the magnified celebration of ability that eludes the audience from the argument on how somatic limitations may function against the normative idea of dance, thus also depriving the audience's stare the scope to suspect its own judgment of the ideal body. Yet, at the same time, considering Chandran's desire to reclaim the space of performance as a previously able-bodied dancer, one must not be too ambitious to cast her in the role of a disability rights activist. In fact, her choice of discreteness in movement, interestingly, did carve the way for more performers with disability to understand their own kinesthetic potential. That is, shifting the axis of gaze from the ability of movement of lower limbs as an integral part of dance to facial expressions and upper body movements, so that Chandran offered dancers ways to experiment with alternate somatic abilities. On a similar note, during my interaction with a Bangalore-based Kathak and Bharatanatyam dancer, Mysore Nagaraj, questions on individual ability and alternate methods of pedagogy for dancers with disability was addressed. Although Nagaraj is a non-disabled Kathak dancer, he was introduced to a group of visually challenged Bharatanatyam dancers in 2011 to continue their training under his guardianship. In 2012, a trust was created by them for them by the name of Articulate Abilities, and soon after, more students were encouraged to take admission, gradually making the classroom space an inclusive one with both dancers with disability and dancers without disability. Though himself a trained Kathak dancer, Nagaraj took recourse to his earlier training in Bharatanatyam, as he realized that one of the integral characteristics of Kathak is chakkars, which clearly became a hindrance for his students with visual disability. However, not letting their disability become a handicap for them, Nagaraj soon realized that, I quote him here, the loss of one perception is a heightened perception of some other, unquote. For instance, his students have a sharp sense of direction and distance from the source of sound, which helps them comprehend the dimensions of the space of performance. Nagaraj thus discovered that to enable their movement and understanding of the space, speakers must be arranged on either side of the stage in a manner that sound waves cluster in front or behind their bodies if they are standing in the center. That is, with a nuanced understanding of sound, they can now effectively anticipate their position on the stage. Nagaraj, through his interaction with the students, also became cognizant of the fact that people with disabilities require an alternate.
जो है नेट पे फोकस करके निकालें, अब फिर इधर भी आए हम।
I request all people present here to mute themselves and be careful that they do not accidentally unmute themselves as well. Yes, Suman, you can please continue.
Yeah. So Nagaraj, through his interaction with the students, has also become cognizant of the fact that people with disabilities require an altered methodology of engagement vis-a-vis the space of performance and the audience. In order to ensure that this orientation is not disturbed, Nagaraj first walks the students across the stage parameters and then maps the stage with guiding ropes. These ropes are arranged with one in the front, 2 feet away from the edge, and one across the center, which helps the dancers visualize a spatial frame within which they must perform. The curiosity for me still remained in the fact in understanding how the memory of training within classroom space gets intersected with the act of performing for an audience. According to Nagaraj, people with visual disability have to rely on body memory even more than able-bodied dancers. Although body memory is both a natural and a conscious effort that non-disabled dancers also engage with, in most cases, much contribution is also made by collecting visual memory of the guru's movement and their own as reflected in the studio mirrors. So for people with optical disability, a referential visual memory is absent. And so unlike non-disabled dancers, they have to rely on tactile learning and audio receptions. In the process, they also have to construct and preserve muscle memory, which is their constant reference point. Nagaraj further says that since dancers with disability often attempt to compensate for the absence of physical ability, they inevitably sensitize all other points of reception. Susan Foster, in her work Dancing Bodies, looks at these training bodies by dissecting them into 2 categories, that is the perceived and tangible body and the aesthetically ideal body. The perceived body is the dancer's body that is continuously under self-supervision. The aesthetically ideal body is the one which has been culturally conceived as a collective idea. The third kind of body that imposes its persistent presence during the course of training, according to Foster, is then the demonstrative body, which she defines as, I quote, the demonstrative body displays itself in the body of the teacher and sometimes in one's own image in the mirror and in the bodies of other students in the class and their mirror images. For example, when I look at another student in the class, I see her or his body not as that of a friend or an acquaintance, but as the bodily instantiation of desired or undesired, correct or incorrect values, unquote. To understand how demonstrative body functions in Nagaraj's classes, which also inevitably constructs the perceived and the ideal body, I asked him about the pedagogy he had adapted so far. He gave the credit of his ability to teach visually challenged people to Buse Gowda, one of the dancers from his first batch of students. Gowda is a dancer with visual disability, found it particularly hard to verbally follow the teacher's instructions. So in order to overcome this handicap, Gowda requested Nagaraj to allow him to follow his facial muscles with his hands in order to imitate the same on his own face. Immediately, Nagaraj linked this with tactile perception that years of interaction with Braille had made Gowda and other visually challenged people sensitive about. The line sketched on Nagaraj's face each time there was a change in expression was traced by Gowda and other students with their fingers and then repeatedly carved on their own body. This practice was further modulated when students with different degrees and years of visual disability started seeking admission in articulate abilities. For instance, with students who have had some visual experience of the world before losing their eyesight, Nagaraj nudges them to foreground their body memory and life experiences with respect to emotions and sensations. On the other hand, with the totally blind or born blind, he asks them for their own life experiences, freezes that moment for them, and asks them to internalize that muscular tension and facial expression and relate it to the emotion that is required by the performance. The demonstrative body in this school, unlike in most performing arts schools, keeps changing from Nagaraj as the initial instructor to senior students training new batches. Since the institute does not adhere by the normative ideas of who can dance and how, the training learning process is also not designed in a normative result-oriented manner. This flexibility in learning Indian classical dance for one's own sake, rather than being an exemplification of the state cultural body performative, allows a more liberal conversation with their unique somatic potential. Further, the hierarchy of authority is also broken as students that are senior take up the role of training younger dancers. Nagaraj believes that when two students with the same or similar disability interact, then their physical communication is relatively uninhibited, as opposed to a student practicing tactile learning through his or her teacher's body. But does that mean that his students are completely relieved from any kind of an evaluation? According to Nagaraj, this is not the case, and instead of conventional ways of examining his students, their regular practice is a means of tracking progress in dance. He does, however, subject the students to the ceremony of Arangetram, or the initiation of the dancer to the proscenium, except he prefers to call it Rang Pravesh, which would loosely translate as entering the performance stage, thereby further distancing them from the denomination of normative and institutional idea of classical dance. And yet, if there is any doubt about their articulation being inadequate, Nagaraj states, I quote, disabled people are perfectionists because they have no scope for improvisation. Since they have to synchronize their movement with others, their movement has to be perfect, unquote. Now, although this statement has been made with the intention to silence the skepticism aimed at dancers with disability, it does inevitably foreground the binary ideas of imperfection and perfection and disability and ability. So a more detailed reading of how often dancers with disability question the normative and also succumb to the collective idea of normal and perfect is something that I'm going to explore. At the same time, it's also important to look at the manner in which the audience has received the presence of dancers with disability occupying the proscenium and the systematic discrimination that continues. In the light of this, Gowda says, I quote him, the audience expresses disbelief in the possibility of a blind dancer performing. While this disbelief changes into awe by the end of the performance, I find it amusing that the audience can be so ignorant, unquote. He further confessed that it deeply upsets him to see that sympathy that the audience shows and during the performance seems to end once the event comes to a close. The question that arises here is the curiosity that people express towards dancers with disability and the reason why a systematic discrimination against them still prevails. To understand the intrinsic idea of invisibilizing bodies with disability or invisibilizing the disability in a body, one can refer to the medical lens through which disability was perceived in the 18th and 19th century. Davis's essay titled Constructing Normalcy looks at the influence of a statistical analysis of the political arithmetic on state machinery that had started to visualize human body as a useful tool to gain social advancement. The body of a man also became a site, S-I-G-H-T, or site, S-I-T-E, as the place for study, and thus a hegemony of ideally structured body. This may or may not necessarily be in imitation of the classical body, but must possess the characteristics of benefiting a capitalist society. The manifestation of a resourceful corporeality thus created a new norm which brought under its wing most of the population, except those who were physically and medically deviant. Thus, an ideal was reimagined, which was more accommodating in nature to the minor corporeal deflections than before, yet discrimination towards visibly disabled people continued to prevail. Subsequently, as medical sciences progressed, development in the field of prosthetics provided partial support to people with disabilities, and the human body became a biomedical model that gained resurgence. At the same time, performing arts continued to be a practice that restored to the idea of able-bodied beings, and an attempt was made to preserve the normative that was threatened by the presence of alternate bodies. However, able-bodied classical performing art dancers are not impervious to disability and have been subjected to challenges that have penetrated the ideal. Rupika and Sabrawal and Sonia Singh's work samples around 40 female Kathak dancers in the age group of 18 to 35, of which over 90% subjects showed pronated feet. Besides common feet injuries, signs of spinal trauma, inflammation of the skin of the feet due to repeated bare feet movement on a flat ground, as well as improper circulation and inflammatory rashes have been noted by them. A later study by Chandan with 100 cases reiterates the result as pronated feet and musculoskeletal tensions in the legs of Kathak dancers. The studies are a significant reading of the often overlooked physical trauma that dancers in classical training undergo. Besides, the study also intends to restore the normal body movement in dancers to prevent long-term ailments, considering their professional engagements. Oftentimes, such biomedical studies do not gain attention outside the medical fraternity, and a relative silence is maintained in the dance community as well. It may be so because overcoming these injuries is central to the practice of securing a normative appearance of a performer. Hence, during my conversation with various artists, similar questions about temporary disability were deliberately raised. For instance, Kumudani Lakhia's biography mentions her miscarriages that was a consequence of countless rehearsals before her performance. She says in her biography that once a miscarriage happens, the womb gets used to throwing up. Amongst other dancers interviewed, 2 of them spoke about their experiences during menstrual cycles and the physical challenges that they encounter every month, of which one shared her stories about severe cramps every month. In fact, there are times when the pain gets so excruciating for her that she vomits and passes out. The said dancer found it amusing when I said, "Do you ever see it as a point of temporary disability?" For her, the body can be tuned in and out of a performance by prompting the body memory constructed through months of practice, and once on stage, temporarily forgetting all physical constraints. While it may be true that an attempt to overcome physiological barriers is pivotal to a performance, it becomes equally imperative to allow slippages, gaps, errors, injuries to expose itself to the audience. I emphasize here that performers must invite the viewers to see the lines of fractures and failures in an apparently seamless rendition, and possibly engage them with the corporal exercise of the work produced. Elizabeth Dempster, in her work Women Writing the Body, raises a similar issue with regard to an unbridgeable distance maintained by the ideal classical body, modeled by ballet dancers, and the elusive presence created by them through their performance. In contrast to the perfected body, she talks about the postmodern body of a dancer. Dempster states, I quote her, "The body in postmodern dance is unstable, fleeting, flickering, transient, a subject of multiple representations." Unquote. It is the shifting quality of the postmodern body that challenges the norm and does not simply make itself a depository of cultural ideologies. It is true that this is being frequently explored by Kathak dancers who tend to mesh their style with contemporariness in performing arts and attempt to thematically perform somatic neuroses, emotional collapses, unguarded self, amidst other subjects. However, this vulnerability is still limited to physically articulating the narrative, rather than exposing the lived individual experience of it. Consequently, the scope for receiving injuries, limitations, challenges, and finally disability as part of the performing arts repertoire is still beyond comprehension for an able-bodied audience who only get a fraction of the unguarded, though choreographed and textual side of the performer. Finally, what we have is a largely able-bodied group of dancers kinesthetically conversing with able-bodied subjects, attentively received by non-disabled dancers who aspire to vicariously participate in the ritual. Do I have time? I'm so sorry.
I didn't want to interrupt you, Suman, but I think you've overshot time quite a bit. So could you please wind up?
Sure, sure. Thank you so much. So there was actually one more subject, and I didn't want to introduce that other subject. This is a person with Down syndrome, Saili Agwane, who is a Kathak dancer based in Pune, and it's an elaborate study. So I'll just pause at that, and yeah. So I'll very quickly wrap up with my conclusion, because this that also includes my interviews with Agwane and her mother.
Yes,
Yeah. In conclusion, I would just very quickly say that although Agwane, like Gowda and Nagraj, also talks about trying to achieve a sense of perfection through her performances, and it might seem like a little problematic kind of a statement, because every time in the interviews, the sentence that was made by all of them was that we managed to look normal in our performances, we managed to overcome our disability. So what I'm trying to say through my paper is that, what happens to a person with disability who does not feel compelled to conform by the rules of classical Indian dance, not by the need to excel the ableist language of dance as they are doing over here? How does the language of dance change when people with disability choose not to comply by their physical abilities and try to destabilize the structural hierarchy of the performing and the performative dance body and adapt an alternate movement vocabulary? I believe at this point, the body with disability itself becomes a non-institutional, non-normative text that can be read by the audience. And since it refuses to adhere to the needs of the collective memory of the audience, it also creates a scope for their unique reception. The dancer's body with disability will still be a subjective gaze, but one that desires to tell its own story, its own narrative, which may time and again slip, break, or even transcend the systemic territories of the dance protocols. This agency to tell one's own corporal narrative essentially rejects ableist expectations. In fact, while using the vocabulary of classical dance, the person becomes an embodiment of dance and narrates their own autobiography through the movement pattern individual to their body. So Saili's mother, during a conversation, expressed a desire to see her daughter teach Kathak to non-disabled dancers. That confession stirred thoughts of hope that by visibilizing dancers with disabilities...
Suman, I think we need to wind up now, please.
Yeah, so these are just like the last lines of the paper, yeah. So that the visibilizing dancers with disability, even if through an ableist language of institutional dance, there will still be a schism in the normative. It will induce a culture of the individual as part of the collective rather than a manifestation of the hegemonic practices. So as of now, if Saili, Gowda, and students of Nagra choose to imitate gods and goddesses from the Hindu mythology, then it must not be questioned. Instead, it must be seen as an onset of commenting on the Natya Shastra and the Puranas that had earlier ostracized them from the proscenium. Sorry, and thank you so much for giving me so much time to speak.
Thank you, Suman, and thank you for bringing in Indian performance epistemologies and their critique, and then going down to modern day times when because of cultural nationalism, modern day how there were modern day interventions that led to the standardization and, as you call it, the sanitization of postures, as well as the role of the media. And I think largely the paper was about how performance itself is normalization, how performance is ableism and cultural exclusivity, and how dance forms can disrupt this kind of a construction, right, Suman? So organizers, do we take the questions along with the papers, or do we leave them for the end?
That's up to you, Bani. You can take it now or leave it for the end.
Okay, Andrima. So if there are any questions, I think we can take them right now before we move on to the next presenter. And interpreters, is the pace of delivery okay, or do we need to ask the presenters to slow down? Stuti and Garima, could you please give me a response?
Great if you little bit slow, just a little.
Right. So with that little note to the next presenter, just let me get to the presentations page. So the next presenter is Jaya Sarkar. who is pursuing her PhD in Cultural Studies at BITS Pilani Hyderabad campus. Her proposed thesis examines the aesthetics of the post-human and disabled bodies, post-humanist literature, hyper-narrative interactive films, and interactive story applications. She has edited a book titled Industrial Melanism, an Evolutionary Reverse Swing, published in April 2019. Her research article, Reading Hypertext as Cyborg, The Case of Patchwork Girl, was published in the Web of Science and Scopus Indexed Rupkatha Journal on Interdisciplinary Studies in Humanities. She is also a member of the Indian Post-Humanism Network. Her article, Indian Superscript Cyborg, Deconstructing Normativity Through Feminist Post-Humanism, has been published on the official website of the Indian Post-Humanism Network. I invite Jaya to present her paper on conceptualizing resistance through disability performance art, with a small request, to be slightly slow so that our sign language interpreters can pick up what you are saying and communicate it effectively. Jaya.
Sure, I'll keep that in mind. Thank you for the introduction, and thank you for the organizers for giving me the opportunity to present here today. Just give me a minute to share my screen. Okay. So my presentation, which is titled as Conceptualizing Resistance Through Disability Performance Art, will demonstrate how the disabled body, which had been isolated and confined in institutions for long, is emerging out of the boundaries of academic study and into the streets, stages, and daily lives of the non-disabled. Bodies of disabled performance artists challenges the system from the stage by pushing back against the barriers of normativity. Drawing on Jasbir Pua's theory of assemblage, which de-individualizes agency, my paper will interrogate how the aesthetics of disability performances invite the audience to accept rather than reject unfamiliar physical forms. Using Tobin Siebers and Rosemary Garland Thompson's concept of disability aesthetics, the paper will challenge the particular inclination to equate normalcy with beauty. The bodies of disabled performance artists threaten the fantasies of the non-disabled and generates a normative anxiety when it is represented as aesthetically beautiful. Tobin Siebers, in his book Disability Aesthetics, tries to correct the fact that most non-disabled people have a difficult time believing the fact that disabled artists could also make significant contributions to art, either as symbols of aesthetic beauty or by making art themselves. Siebers says that modern art constantly evolves a powerful connection to disability with its techniques and by the embrace of bodies. He predicts that the emergence of disability aesthetics might establish disability as a critical framework that questions the presuppositions underlying definitions of aesthetic production and appreciation. In disability aesthetics, Tobin Siebers has advanced the arguments of Michel and Snyder that modern art has increasingly questioned the art object's relation to perfection to the point where disability, disease, and injury have become the figures by which the aesthetic beauty as such is now recognized. Artworks created and performed by artists with disabilities is often a site of knowledge for both the artist and the audience. The site is an intersection of identity, ideology, language, politics, social oppression, and the body. Disability arts expose and exploit various ways to claim disability identity for the artist. Once disabled performance artists appear on the stage, their bodies become text for the audience to study and interpret. However, the artists focus on transforming that spectacle into a site of power. They use their bodies to claim their disability so that the audience could celebrate it. Petra Coopers, a disability culture activist, community artist, and a professor of English, who describes herself as an on-off wheelchair and crutch user, has produced a body of work which includes both Tobin Siebers' disability aesthetics and Michel and Snyder's cultural characterization of disability in 21st century art. Her performance work figures individuals with physical, psychiatric, and intellectual disabilities to represent restriction and contained spaces imposed physically or socially. With her performance work, Coopers transform the private experience of disability into public, not as an expose, but to stake a claim for the commonality of experience that might otherwise remain unvoiced. So I will just play a short clip in which we see Coopers narrating a poem which she has written.
1, 2, 3. This is the opening poem of Dattani, a poetry collection about healing and language. In this first poem, I'm going to invite you to join with me in 3 motions. I'm going to invite you to bow and hold your heart, your stomach, and your sexual organs. I'll do that with you. As you're doing it, think about what this action, what this movement means in your culture and what it means to you. Sucker punch, the knife in the street, fear of being sheared out of the stream into the backwater, dead fish belly up by the side of the pond, pills and poisons and endings, let go and sever the ties and ignore the party is always elsewhere. A shadow in a canoe, in a photo, likely put on Facebook tomorrow. Fake of having fun, behind the grass, the tree, a Stephen King book where I know the next sentence already. Primacy of white masculine fear, close the leaky gut, body drained of tears. Just speak, walk with me, close the loop. Bow forward, pour yourself into your capable hands and hold your heart. Bow forward, pour your stomach into your feeble hands. Release the binds that bind so tightly to your spinal column. Bow again, drop your sexual organs into waiting hands. Wait, breathe in, soothe. Fish slip into the labyrinth of intestines, cruise past the atlas, feed on the carpet fibers of worry. Agile between the lung pearls, hollow behind the liver, green wall, delicate black veined spider along for companionship, dark purple, maroon. Fins soothe the red spots of tension, white bands where muscles have leached nourishment out of tight bands. Between kidney and uterus, raspy tongue licks soggy dahlias on their stalks, ovaries bloom. Glide, mucus oils the way, swim among the velvet, you and me into plump cushions, sturgeon tumbling ground. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah. So disability activist and theorist Rosemary Garland Thompson's Rosemary Garland Thompson's freakery examines the could the organizers please mute that?
Can I please request the organizers to?
Yes, I'm on it. I'm just trying to remove.
Okay, thank you. So Rosemary Garland Thompson's freakery examines the representation of freakishness and its exhibition in societies, demonstrating how public displays of extraordinary bodies facilitate the definition of cultural distinctions as natural, thereby bringing to the forefront a variety of social hierarchies and inequitable power relationships. Disability performance then reenacts the primal scene of disability, in which the normative viewer encounters the disabled body and then they demand an explanation. Garland Thompson argues that in the social context of an ableist society, the disabled body summons the starer and the stared mandates their story. So the freakish body functions as a kind of a shrine to threaten democratic ideas of freedom and independence. The beauty of disability performances also invites the viewers to accept these freakish bodies and to broaden their understanding of normativity and non-normativity, and how there has been a transformation in the behaviors. The disability also urges the disability community to imprint the disabled bodies and minds on the public landscape and to come with new modes of beauty that attacks the traditional aesthetic and political standards of uniformity, balance, hygiene, and integrity. In close relation to Garland Thompson's argument, disability performance artists like Petra Coopers, Mary Duffy, Carrie Sandhall, they challenge the particular inclination to equate normality with beauty in Western aesthetics. They engage their bodies through their works to call out the cultural expectations and objectifications. Through their performances, they give rise to intersectional sites of critical intervention, witness, and interrogation by placing their own bodies in the very space that serve as source of their objectification. This represents a reconsideration of the discourse of disability in art and emphasizes the critical role of art in troubling the social and political issues of ableism. Disability performance artists represent an appropriation of a sideshow method with the intention of transforming the objectifying stares of the viewers into the moments of their own personal agency through the performative act of staring back from the stage. The figure of Venus de Milo is an important example to which disability theorists keep coming back. The aesthetic quality of the artwork is there primarily because of the absence of both of the arms, Taubenziber believes. In René Magritte's version of the Venus, the splashed blood red pigment on the arm stumps represent a recent amputation. Mary Duffy, a performance artist without arms, identifies herself with Venus de Milo. She questions the traditional Western construction of beauty through the articulation of disability aesthetics. Her performance as the living Venus de Milo encompasses the two modes of looking, staring at the freakish body and also gazing at the art of the beautiful female body. The audience who stares at her notices a deviation from the normate, but could not help their rapt gaze and the intrusive stare. Duffy, however, stares back at the audience, insisting upon her self-definition. This unsettles the traditional assumptions about femininity, disability, and the aesthetics of the body. This induces a sort of shock value in the audience by attacking the imaginary and to determine how the body norms should be. Galen Lear, a musician and a disability rights activist who hails from Duluth, Minnesota, has brittle bone disease, because of which her body is small, and she therefore, to be able to play the violin, she has to bow the violin like a cello. She uses a loop pedal to multiply her instrumental melodies, creating a rich textural fabric that undulates beneath her ethereal mezzo-soprano. Galen speaks about the relationship between her disability and her music. Her submission videos begins with herself out of the frame, a conscious artistic choice, she explains. She remarks that she didn't necessarily want her disability to be the very first impression people had. It's not that because she is ashamed of it in any way, but she really wanted her music to be judged. She has appeared in several major festivals and has captivated audiences around the world with her unique mix of haunting original songs and traditional fiddle tunes. She uses her music as a platform to advocate for disabled people and to promote positive social change. This represents the inclusion of disabled people doing art and how it places an emphasis upon the representation of difference through admiration and appreciation, in which the disabled artists are admired only because of their ability to create work similar to other non-disabled artists. Galen Lear's performances focus on her musical talent rather than on her disability. The appreciation and admiration which she receives are because of her ability to create haunting original songs and fiddle tunes. This discourses of queer theory, films, globalization, and contemporary literature represent the aesthetics and politics of disability and how they are transformed and developed in disability art. The new forms of art represent the body as a primary aesthetic symbol. Forget what you know about disability. This is the motto from Victoria Modesta's video song Prototype. The song focuses on what the future prototype of a human is, part human, part technology. She combines natural and artificial in her song instead of juxtaposing them on top of the other. And through the song, Modesta brings to attention a new body image for women with disabilities and new adaptation patterns for people with disabilities. Modesta is armed with one of her prostheses, a spike leg, and she becomes an incarnation of monstrous femininity and a pop cultural cyborg. She uses her body as the artistic subject and creates new design dimensions geared towards innovative ways of social engagement through sensation, emotion, and healing. She challenges people's perceptions of limiting disabilities and the impact of these on their social status by redesigning possibilities for the body. She changes emancipatory disability narration and moves it closer to cyberpunk by exploring issues of avant-garde and combining technology with art. So her alternative limbs function as both fashion items and art projects, modifying her into a bionic pop artist. So the song which I have been talking about, Prototype, is Modesta's most popular artwork. It was produced as a part of the Born Risky campaign launched by Channel 4, which is mainly focused on issues of diversity, discovering alternative voices, and introducing creative phenomenon. So her prosthesis wields superpower, but its connotations with new identity and individuality are more important, encouraging people to stand up for themselves. I'll just play a few seconds of the clip so that everyone has an understanding of what I'm saying.
Right.
Okay. So moving to the Indian context, bilingual poet and writer Abhishek Anika performs uh, mm, live, but after the COVID lockdown, he started sharing his work on social media platforms, hoping to continue doing what he loves best, that is, provoke meaningful conversations about disability. So his spoken word poem, Grammar or Vyakaran, addresses the stereotypes and terminologies around disability. He has released the poem in a lyric video from where he is heard reading out the lines in Hindi and English as the words play out in text. Anika hopes that the poem will help trigger meaningful conversations about disability, and he is clear that he seeks to connect with everyone, disabled as well as non-disabled, through his performance. So this is the last performance clip before I conclude. So to conclude with, I'll refer to Bill Hughes, who talks about the discrimination against disabled people. And he thinks how that discrimination is born out of fear pity, and disgust of the non-disabled, and is also a result of negative social representations. So when these disabled performance artists are represented as aesthetically beautiful and powerful, it creates an existential insecurity for the non-disabled, which results in the rise of a feeling of anguish. Victoria Modesta and Abhishek Anika and others do the same with their work. And by showing their disability as a weapon, they wield power over the normative audience. The capacity of the disabled body to disturb the cultural expectations is universal. They disturb the comfortable settlements of civility, narrow ableist notions about proper behavior and bodily norms. So this sort of visual culture not only serves to raise public consciousness, but also helps them to bear witness and promote collective healing. While watching performances by disabled artists, the audience are forced to think about the represented experiences of disability and to confront their own beliefs of ableist norms and expectations through the act of staring. Disability performance art helps achieve this connection between the physical and the cognitive, and to further add layers to the material and the immaterial forces affecting disability representation. Thank you.
Thank you, Jaya. From the earlier paper by Suman, which kind of explored how persons with disabilities, are trying to subvert classical performances and the normative bodies involved in it, to talking of disability performance art as a kind of self-narration that merges the visual and the narrative, and thus becomes a genre in itself to present the disabled body in performance. Okay. The disabled, I think what Jaya you were trying to say is that instead of conforming to a script and then trying to subvert it, what disability performance art does it that it acts out the story by itself on its own terms, and that creates its particular path. And I thank you for a very detailed presentation with impactful clips. The paper is now open for discussion. If there are any questions or observations, I welcome the audience to respond to the paper. So there is an observation, Jaya, from Suman. I hope you can read it. It says, yeah. What a fascinating research. The connection of prosthetics with the cyborg is so interesting to read into. Thank you. And Suman, since you are here, there is also a question for you. Please hang on. After the interaction with Jaya, we'll get back to you. Any other questions or observations? Right, thank you, Jaya, for that very interesting paper, which takes disability performance into an area which is much more powerful, according to me personally, than subverting established norms. Although I don't mean to bring in a kind of comparative parameter here, just personal thoughts. So moving on.
Thank you.
Yeah. Then. Are you here, Suman?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Yes, I can take Shilpa ma'am's question now.
Yes. So should I read it out for you?
Yeah, it's visible on my chat box. Please let me know if I'm reading it correctly.
Yeah.
The question asks if the dancers who are performing the mythological stories are aware of the involvement of disability in the dance, in the mimetic acts. I hope I've understood it correctly. So, what my interactions with them has led me to understand is that while they may be aware of the kind of narrative that they are producing, it is still a very ableist narrative that they are producing. So they're not, the attempt is largely to imitate an ableist style of performance, if I may put it that way, while also being aware of one's own bodily expressions and bodily limitations. So, what my research aims to do is to expose the kind of fractures it creates in the way these mythological stories have been received by the audience so far. And when you are seeing a body with disability perform, let's say the dance of Shiva or the dance of Krishna in a manner that has not been received so far, it creates an alternate narrative. So I mean, I don't know if I answered your question entirely or if I even understood your question in its entirety. So please correct me if that's the case.
Shilpa, if you are there.
Professor Mahanta, I can't see Shilpa here. Not sure whether she's with us or not.
Okay, so no problems there. I think Suman, you answered the question that she raised. So we'll move on since we are being pretty generous with time. I think we now need to hurry up a little bit, just a little bit, and move on quickly to the next presenter, who will be speaking on writing disability and disabled writing, gazing at Dattani's Tara through a glass impaired. He is Dr. Asijit Datta, who is currently working as assistant professor and head English at the Heritage College, which is affiliated to Calcutta University. In July 2021, he began functioning as assistant editor at the Journal of Posthumanism, published by the Transnational Press, London. He has previously taught at Presidency University, Vidyasagar University, Ramakrishna Mission, Narendrapur, and Bethune College. He did his MA in English from Presidency in 2009 and PhD from the Department of Film Studies, Jadavpur University in 2017. Dr. Asijit, can you please take over?
Yes, am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Right. So my paper is titled Writing Disability and Disabled Writing, Gazing at Dattani's Tara Through a Glass Impaired. So I'm a little confused regarding my own paper because I'll be raising so many questions, which is primarily to do with text and performance. Primarily, these questions would be, if I'm reading a play which deals with disability, or a novel for that sake, is my reaction the same when I am looking at it? You know, primarily I'll concern myself with a play. So when I'm reading a play like Tara, which deals with the extreme ends of disability, we are at the disabled extremes in Tara. So what is my reaction as a reader, and what will be my reaction as a person who goes to the theater and, you know, watches the same performance? As a theater director myself, I am myself a bit confused, because I think if I am in the presence of those disabled bodies as an audience, what would my reaction be? Rather, what would my reaction be as an audience, or what would my reaction be as a director? Will there be a difference when we take different roles? Is also what this paper might try to look at. And also, if a disabled, I would say that an inclusion of disability, a kind, I think, breaks down a particular piece of work, disables the work. And if I'm using, if I'm allowed to use it as a verb. I think when a play or a work of art deals with disability, it in turn disables the work, for that matter. And by disabling the work, does it instill a kind of ethical shame within the audience and a need to act and be responsible is also what I'm looking at. Does the play force us, the audience, into a zone of participation? Because we're always away from the disabled body, so to speak. And this play, I think, is far more complicated. Very strangely, a disabled, no reading of disability per se has accompanied Tara per se. I don't know why. But it is not just a play about disability, but rather within the play we see the efforts of writing a play on disability, because there's a character called Chandan who is trying to write a play about his disabled sister, and of course failing constantly. So it is a kind of meta-theatrical comment on disability. To enter my paper, Dattani's Tara is an intricate study of the lives of Chandan and Tara, born as conjoined twins and separated after multiple sinuous and medical procedures. As a disabled woman under a perpetual patriarchal scanner, and brilliantly actually here, Dattani combines patriarchy with science and technology against the normal biological body. And I'm using the word normal very cautiously to imply the body that one is born with and not the body one gets, and especially, taking the cue from the paper that preceded mine, especially not the cyborg body, though it has its the human body, the human machine assemblage has a long way to go from here. But Dattani would go technically against that primarily in a country like India, in a setting where science or technology can also be used in tandem with patriarchy, where you cannot always distinguish between them. So as a disabled woman under a patriarchal scanner, Tara suffers from a kind of double subalternity, physical and gendered. In Tara's mother, Bharati, the oppression adds up to cognitive disability. On the other hand, Chandan, who is Tara's brother and the conjoined twin also, perpetually experiences the trauma of separation from his sister, the onslaught of memories where every remembrance is a reawakening of the failures of a dysfunctional family. Dattani's Tara is a campaign for an empathic awareness of the lives of independent women in a heteronormative society and subjecthood of disabled persons. Chandan, who later becomes Dan, actually, D-A-N, when he goes to the United States, is an aspiring dramatist attempting an autobiographical play on his deceased sister, Tara. His failure to proceed with a theatrical reconstruction of events that comprise and shape the initial years of his oppressed life serves as the ground on which the entire plot is reflected. Therefore, Dan's commemorative writing is linked to a kind of externalization of guilt and trauma and transforming truth into fiction, and by extension, alleviating damaging effects of such memories. References to music and artists too have been inserted by Dattani with the utmost care. Tara bears her artificial leg to the three girls in her locality with the explosive opening of Brahms' first concerto playing in the background. Tara's prosthetic leg is not only asexual and machinic, but goes on to define her subjecthood outside the patriarchal discourse surrounding the female body. If Chandan is obsessed with Brahms's quality of high tragedy and romance, of youth bursting forth in the world with all its claim, Tara asserts that Beethoven must have been a passionate man. Historically, Brahms's progress as a musician was crippled by the legacy of Beethoven, and it took him 20 years to write his first composition. Tara finds herself attached to Beethoven, who wrote some of his most renowned symphonies as a middle-aged deaf man. Chandan is unvaryingly haunted by the shadow of Tara, a spectre that initiates him into the writing process but paralyzes him with the subsequent evocation of guilt. Dan is in desperate need of distance from his past, which is also a past of disability, from the physical association with his home and homeland. This will provide him with the artistic objectivity and insight to compose his play. However, the geographical widening brings in other loaded terms related to Dan, because outside he's not just a disabled man, actually. He is a brown, handicapped, intellectual, immigrant, freak, and finally a rejected author for not exhibiting the condition of India's colonial past. As Chandan's dead Siamese other, Tara is not only embedded inside his being, but secured into him as nerves and body parts. She can neither be erased by distance nor removed by writing. Dan's efforts to manifest Tara onto the white surface of papers will always be stuck in a loop of returning and arriving. Dattani plunges us to the innards of dramatic creation. We encounter a dramatist in the middle of his writing, recreation, reformulation of personal dread and trauma. And I'm quoting from the play what Dan says, that in poetry, even the most turbulent emotions can be recollected when one is fast asleep. But in drama, even tranquility has to be recalled with emotion, like touching a bare live wire. Try distancing yourself from the experience and writing about it. A mere description will be hopelessly inadequate. And for me, I have to relive that charge over and over again. Unquote. Asha Kuthari Chaudhary finds a parallel between the meta-theatricality of the play and the multiple rehearsals before going into the operation theater. And I love this comparison that Asha Kuthari brings in here. The separation itself was quite complicated. And this is the line that is uttered by Dr. Thakkar, who performed the operation. And he says, the separation itself was quite complicated. We had about 6 rehearsals with dummies to make sure that every detail was considered in terms of the physical movements of the surgeons during the operation as well as surgical procedure. Unquote. Dan's desire to make capital of my trauma, I quote, my anguish and make it my tragedy, to masticate them in my mind and spit out the result to the world in anger, unquote, is Dattani's disclosure of the invisible issues in art, making artistic capital out of angst, sorrow, or feeling of the subjects. So primarily, if you're writing about disability, and this has always been my question as well, if you're writing about disability, if as a theater artist myself, I put a disabled artist on the stage, how authentic am I being? Am I doing it because it is something that would bring me to attention for doing something which is aberrant, which is different, which other people would not venture into? Do I exploit the disabled body while attempting to make it into art? I think these are the subtle questions addressed by Dattani as well, where Dan attempts to write a play about Tara. The problem with Dan is he himself is a disabled body, or he himself was a Siamese twin and is surviving because of the separation that was done by the doctors, the unethical separation, because the leg which would have should have gone to Tara, because the blood flow was perfect in that leg, was given to Chandan when they were infants. And that, of course, results to the loss of the leg for both the twins, for both the siblings. And that guilt is, of course, carried on forever by Dan. And that becomes a complicated marker when Dan attempts to write the play regarding the disabled body of the sister. So Dan's scrapbook with paper cuttings about Dr. Thakkar and his interviews of sitting at a higher plane are his efforts to exorcise Dr. Thakkar on the metaphysical level. Perhaps removing the source of biological separation will fabricate the space for the parental unity for the prenatal unity, for the prenatal unity of the siblings. And very strangely, the play ends with this, where the two siblings come together and they embrace each other, though Tara is dead. So this happens on a metaphysical, a dream-like, a surreal level, because they both had the desire to go back to that kind of prenatal unity, that kind of unity in the womb or just when they were born. Chandan and Tara coming together also suggests the destruction of Dan's play, the ending of his empty compensation. Dattani's Tara concludes with the wrecking of Dan's Twinkle Tara, and that's what he calls his unfinished play, where wishful fantasy supplants the written word of the agonizing past. Tara underlines the gender stereotyping practiced in her home, in her conversation with Rupa, where she says, Tara says this, the men in the house were decided on whether they were going to go hunting while the women looked after the cave, under quote ends. Tara, on the other hand, is a nonconformist, witty, intelligent, uninhibited, and high-spirited, who longs to be strong, healthy, beautiful. And these traits are that are a continuation of Bharati's dreams for her daughter. Simultaneously, Tara's artificial leg is a repeated reminder of Bharati's consent to donate the 2 of the 3 combined legs to Chandan and her subsequent guilt. The decision was a medical and an ethical error, since the blood circulation to that particular severed leg was seamlessly happening from Tara's body. The 3rd leg doesn't survive on Chandan either, and both the siblings persevere with 1 leg. Therefore, the culpability of Bharati is directly connected to her firmness to compensate by donating her kidney to Tara. And that's how she wants to atone for the guilt of giving the 3rd leg to Chandan. Bharati's sacred offering is an attempt towards a psychological redemption worked out through an overtly somatic framework. The kidney, a bodily organ, becomes a metaphor for psychological purgation of Bharati. At the same time, it is Bharati's dismissal of Patel is the husband, their father, ownership of biological and gendered materials within the family. Bharati's self-condemnation is directly responsible for her nervous breakdown and institutionalization. Though Tara initially savors her mother's overprotection and fanatical care, she feels betrayed after her mother's approval of the operation is revealed towards the end of the play. When Dr. Thakkar is introduced in a mock interview conducted by Dan from Darkness, we are thoroughly exposed to the domain of modern medicine. Dr. Thakkar explains the complex biological mechanism of their formation inside the womb, their miraculous birth, and the necessity of surgery to separate the 3-month-old conjoined twins. Ironically, all of Dr. Thakkar's scientific discourse turns contrived and futile when it is divulged that he unethically performed the surgery in lieu of 3 acres of land from Bharati's father, the absent omniscient figure, to set up his hospital. Patel fails to oppose their joint settlement because of his inter-community marriage between a Gujarati and a Kannadiga, which was the reason behind his family disowning him. The extreme rationalism of science and the ideology of patriarchal society are shown to be working in tandem. It is interesting to note Dr. Thakkar's statement that, I quote, Siamese twins developing from one fertilized ovum are invariably of the same sex, unquote. Dattani employs a trope here by varying their sexes as if to make one, male/female, deficient without the inclusion of the other. The fragmentariness is borne by Dan all his life, even after the ritualistic sacrifice of the women, Bharati and Tara. According to Dan, God's way would have been to keep the twins unharmed, unoperated, to let them die following nature and time. And this is where we take a different route from probably the cyborged person, the man-machine assemblage or the woman-machine assemblage, where they say that, what Dan utterly desires is that they should have died immediately after birth, and that should have been the normal flow of events and not separated by technology. And that's an entirely different route that Dattani takes.
Asijit, sorry to interrupt you, but could you please just bring your arguments together?
Yes. How much time do I have? Okay, I think
a couple of minutes.
Okay, yeah, sure. Thank you. I'll do that right now. So Tara employs an unusual trope of biological freakishness to uncover societal violence against girl children. They are freaks, not just as amputees, but owing to their rebellious slant against socially authored gender conformity. Dattani questions the notions of normality, institutions, and norms in Tara. The injustice in Dattani often emanates from familiar prejudices so deeply rooted that the text itself becomes a site of excavation. I'm just leaving most of the part to conclude my paper, where Tara, as a woman with a disabled body, is doubly marginalized. Her parents initially perceive her as a sacrificial non-being at the altar of their son. There is a reference from Rupa, who is a neighbor, to the old ways practiced by the Patels concerning girl children. And she says the Patels in the old days were unhappy with getting girl babies, dowry and things like that. So they used to drown them in milk. So when people asked about how the baby died, they could say that they choked while drinking her milk, unquote. Later on, Tara's counterbalancing highlights a classic instance of female appropriation of the tools of patriarchy to challenge and subvert the discourse of a male-centric social order. We are offered a platform to choose not between disability and abilities, but amidst varying degrees of disabilities. And I would like to bring here Arthur Quayson's aesthetic nervousness, and I love the name of the book particularly, where Arthur Quayson talks about the texts dealing with disabilities overwhelm the fictional consciousness of the text and lead to a textual and metaphysical impasse. Representation of disability transcends literary territories and neutralizes all assimilations. Constituted as subjects under wholeness and normativity, disabled figures short-circuit the frames of depiction and induce aesthetic nervousness and ethical depth within the text. Quayson observed that every body is subject to chance and contingent events, and once this is realized, it produces a primal scene of extreme anxiety and vertiginous fears of loss and control over the body itself. Contrary to the lens of others, Chandan's homage towards Tara is his quest to write her decaying body under eraser. Dan's linguistic exploration of a body marked by pain and invisibility injects the hysteria within the whole text. A body with a disability is forced into invisibility by over-visibility. It is looked at by abled others only to be negated. What accompanies such denials are other rejections like sexuality, personhood, individual rights, and agency itself. In Tara, Dattani renders the crisis of writing the disabled body, of narrativizing it. Dan picks up his typed sheets and starts tearing them towards the end of the play and admits that his progress has been zero. All I find every day is a one typewritten sheet with the title of the play, my name and address and the date. Nothing changes except the date, unquote. The fictional playwright, and I'm ending it here, the fictional playwright is continually caged within the unchangeable script of the past. It is the eternal recurrence of the same day every other day, where the past enacts itself as the present. The play transmutes into a prolonged nervousness of a playwright in the process of fictionalizing a body with disabilities. For Dan, the play's creation is full of irreversible upheavals since the subject of inquiry is his own Siamese sister. Tara resembles a field lacerated by an interplay between the person and the fictional. Dan recognizes the impossibility of metamorphosing the hard materiality of Tara's body with his excessive contingency, blood loss, and kidney transplants into the performative zone of theater. then in the end desires to exist as a recorded voice. And this is very interesting to me, that he wants to exist as a recorded voice, unearthed, to be unearthed much later and replayed by a stranger. So he wants to exist as a machine-human assemblage rather than a human, just as a voice, a kind of ethereal subject. Dattani culminates the play with Dan's cathartic realization that one either accepts the hegemonic cosmos and subsists as a trace, or, like Tara, resists the force and disappears. I think I would just add one line, which I just wrote before beginning my paper, that I think something opposite happens when we look at a beggar or a Dalit man coming out of a sewer and a person with disability. And this is something very interesting, I think. And I describe this as a kind of visual amnesia, because in the first case, when I'm looking at a beggar or a man who has just come out of the sewer, a kind of deliberate visual forgetting happens, that I turn my gaze somewhere else. I want to avoid that person. But in the second case, in the first case, we overlook. Of course, we overlook the body. But in the second case, I think we look too much. And by looking too much at the disabled body, the sight itself is erased, I think. I think it is crushed by a kind of ableist gaze. Again, that is open to questions. Thank you so much.
Right, Asijit. Thank you very much for a very interesting presentation and for drawing attention to the meta-theatrical strands in, Tara, and how they display a kind of anxiety about dealing with the human body, the disabled body, apart from the more generally explored dimensions of looking at it as a grim view of patriarchal society, or a shockingly blatant violation of medical ethics. But I do not want to go deep into my own observations about the play. I leave that for my concluding remarks. If there are any questions on Dr. Asijit's paper, please you can type them in the chat box or unmute yourselves and ask. Right, so we'll take up the papers again towards the end. Quickly, I'll now move on to the last presenter of the day, Dr. Meher Fatima, who will be speaking on women and the politics of branding disability. Meher, since I do not have your bio note, could you please introduce yourself and then begin?
Sure. Am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Yes, thank you very much. Well, good afternoon to everybody present over here. I am Dr. Meher Fatima, and I teach English in Hamdard Institute of Legal Studies and Research, School of Law, Jamia Hamdard. For the last 3 years, I've been teaching here. Earlier, I was teaching Jamia Millia Islamia in the Department of English. And before that, I began my career by teaching in Jazan University in Saudi Arabia, where I was brought up. I did my PhD on drama by this was a very this was in 2011, and then I continued to explore different avenues, and here I have come, and that's a very short profile of mine, because I don't have enough time to speak more about myself. So can I go further?
Yes, I guess, with the limited time that we have, we would be better served by listening to your paper.
Yes, that's why I just want to keep it very short.
Yeah.
Thank you, sir. Well, it's a great opportunity for me to participate in this IDSC International Conference 2021 on the topic of disability, resistance, disruption, and transgression in this technical session on the theme of disability and performance. Well, my topic is women and the politics of branding disability. With the permission of the chair, I would like to begin my presentation. As a child, thank you, sir. As a child, I had, like any other children, the experience of living with those who are so-called able, and those who are called disabled, the two distinct categories. My father would read the poem for us and explain the beauty of the blindness of the poet. And I would like to read the poem here before I go into my topic. The sonnet 19, When I Consider How My Light is Spent, by John Milton. And I would like to read this beautiful poem. When I consider
Is it Dr. Fatima who's disconnected?
Seems like that, because I'll just try.
Yes, so
Getting
we
in touch
can
with
wait
her.
for a couple
Yeah.
of minutes and hope that she can reconnect.
Am I audible, please?
Yes, you are.
Yeah, I just lost connection because it's power cut here. So I'll just read this poem. When I consider how my light is spent, and sorry, I have to switch off my camera because there's no light here. So when I consider how my light is spent, ere half my days in this dark world and wide, and that one talent which is death to hide, lost with me, useless, though my soul more bent to serve therewith my maker, and present my true account, lest he returning shied, doth God exact date labor light denied? I fondly ask, but patience to prevent that murmur soon replies, God doth not need either man's work or his own gifts, who best bear his mild yoke, they serve him best. His state is kingly, thousands at his bidding speed, and post over land and ocean without rest. They also serve who only stand and wait. Well, it is my father who drew our attention to the beauty of being the other. It was only later that I realized that this beauty may not be appealing to everybody. And also the last line, I often question, which I would repeat, that they also serve who only stand and wait. This line has to be questioned and studied, that those who are waiting are not only standing and waiting, but they are also serving in some way or the other. So this can be deconstructed. So I must admit that I've been learning so much here in this conference about the topic. Today, I would like to focus on several concepts of disability with regard to women in particular. When I read about this conference, I began to ponder over the broader themes of disability leading to resistance, disruption, and transgression. After the brainstorming, I was drawn towards the disability studies and I came across some of the writings and journals that have fascinated me. Now, with the baby steps, I've been discovering the cosmos, the world, which we hardly care to know about because of our limited perception of the notion of being the independent, the accomplishment, and the idea of the self-made person. Well, can we think of a society or a community where its individual can manage their own affairs? Not at all. In order to exist, we have to coexist. Now, the study and the concept of disability in general, and for women in particular, is a historical, social, and cultural construction. I have used a preposition here for women in particular, instead of all women in particular, to point out the difference in the treatment of women with regard to disability, whether disability is a natural, genetic, biological, or accidental condition or not. Rather, it is being designed for the purpose of imposing the tag to create a special kind of notion of disability for women in general. Well, the dictionary defines the term disability in this way. Disability is a physical or mental condition that limits a person's movements, senses, or activities, disability is a disadvantage or handicap, especially one imposed or recognized by the law. My understanding of the term led me to think that nobody is disabled unless he or she is made to feel so. No disability can make one disabled. We human beings are created with multiple abilities. Sometimes some functionalities are more prominent than the others. Or it may be so that some functional parts of the body is missing, and there is a synthesis and a brilliant coordination between the functional prominent and the missing. They complement each other in the process. As a result, the body successfully achieves its functional goals by the cooperation of the surrounding presence. Well, the stigma, stereotypes, and the cultural meanings, these are all linked and they communicate in the cultural construction of disability. It can be understood that it is the culture that plays a pivotal role in either constructing or not constructing disability. The role of the society is important here. It may not be necessarily a condition which an individual faces as the society. The social model rather views the origin of disability as mental attitudes and physical structures of society. The limitations are then not really the cause of disability itself. The two different perspectives are internal and external. It is, I think, the difference that segregates. The normative becomes the master and acquires the center. It assumes and decides what it perceives, what the disabled cannot do, is not able to perform, like the able. It is like saying, if you're not doing it my way, you're not doing it all, you are not doing it all right, or you're just doing it all wrong. Consequently, the power of politics creates the barrier, pushing the other to the periphery. This ghettoization disturbs the balance, making the life of the other difficult and ultimately leading to the chaotic universe. Well, the attitudes of a society could say that the persons who are deviant are incapable of participating or contributing to the society, and therefore they are dependent lot who could rely on charitable organizations and but actually get very little share of dignity. So it is a societal imposition for deviation from the physical norms set by the society. So when we talk of disability for women in particular, there's a politics of branding women with disability or creating the tag, and this tag can be tangible or intangible. Now, an imposition on women and their bodies by cultures, societies, religion, with the interplay of politics and action are found in the world where we live, whether it's India or anywhere else in this entire on this entire planet. Now, leading to resistance from the subjugated, who are these women, it gives birth to the outrage. Now, these concepts of marginalized identities are represented or have been represented in literature, theories, art, painting, media, in its own ways. Now, when I was reading On My Blindness by John Milton, I was compelled to read the other work, that is The Mad Woman in an Attic. This is A Mad Woman in the Attic, the woman writer and the 19th century literary imagination, which was published in 1979. It's a book by Sandra Gilbert and Susan Gerber. It's quite a popular work, which examines basically the literature of the Victorian time from a perspective of the feminist. Now, these two feminists, they draw the title from Charlotte Bronte's Jane Eyre. Jane Eyre is a very interesting novel. As English honors student, it was absolutely interesting to read and appreciate the hero in it, who's Rochester. But it is only when we are sensitive to this issue and when we're sensitive to the idea of disability, we realize that it is Rochester's wife, the so-called hero, whose name is Bertha Mason, is actually kept secretly locked in an attic apartment by her husband. Because the madness, to brand women who are deviating from the norm. They can be separated, they can be segregated, they can be kept away, so that a normal society can function in its own way. Now here there's another book, another piece of literature that I was just looking at, and then I studied, and then it just gave me this idea that the madness for Shakespeare's Hamlet is different from the madness that Charlotte Bronte's Jane Eyre's Bertha has. So madness for Shakespeare's Hamlet is a protective shield and a tool to take revenge from his father's murderer. And thus the playwright calls it a feigned madness. So it is actually a liberating process or disposition. Now, issues and challenges of disability faced by women in general is not unusual from any perspective. The lived realities and the experiences are sometimes so horrid that we have to question the normative. So how easy it is to think for a normative that women can be easily ostracized or excluded from the society. Now, coming to next point, that is resistance against disability. When we talk about the resistance against disability, it is like...
Dr. Mehar, can I just interrupt you for a moment?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, this is also to request you to just bring together your arguments and wind up in the next couple of minutes.
Sure, sir. I will. Yeah. I'm just about to end. Okay. Resistance against disability are particularly confined to women's identities. Now, branding of a disability by the masters and the retaliation by the subjugated has attracted scholars to study the discourse in different times and cultures. To explore women resisting the stereotypes with the burden of expectations and the norm of propriety, respectability, the decorum, we have to find them within the confinement of the sacred homes, workplaces for women who form the workforce, menstrual cycle and the taboo, the notion of purity attached to it, sexuality, women and infertility, how infertility is attached to the sacrosanct motherhood, and where the concept of motherhood versus womanhood. And then lastly, the concept of beauty. Here, the cosmetics, beauty pageants, fashion industry, etc., play their role, and the capitalist, ableist managed to have the big share. So the theme of women, disability, and resistance in relation to the politics of ghettoization in the prevailing dominant patriarchal or matriarchal culture milieu points to the incessant struggle of the subjugated from the time immemorial. I would end over here. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Mehar, for sticking to time. Are there any questions for the last presenter or for any of the four presenters? We still have a few minutes, so we can take them up if there are any. Right. If not, then I'll just wind up. Now, this seems to be a particularly apt time to talk about protest, about resistance. And looking around us, I also deliberately start with resistance because, while we have been talking a lot about disability and performance, I think we need to factor in that part also, because that is the thrust area of the conference. So anyway, but looking around us, we see all around ourselves resistance to prevailing structures, almost as part of daily life, right? Like ones in the recent past, which were unsuccessful, to some more recent that are successful and still continuing successfully. And resistance can be, to take the indigenous context, resistance can be as powerful as a single person not eating for 20 odd years, to movements. Okay, so both individual and collective movements that can force governments to their knees, bring down and usher in new laws, maybe even new dispensations. And disability movements, activism, and disability studies as an academic area challenge both these extremities, as also the continuum between them in a society that functions on an ableist understanding of a normal culture that has at its center the normative citizen who is a rational person with a species typical body. Now, every act of resistance, as I see it, is art. It is a creation. And it has the agony of creation, the blood, the sweat, the tears, the whole process, and through the process, the aim towards a probable or at least a desired end. And disability scholars, disability academics, and activists, through their resistance, they have contested, disrupted, and transgressed, to use the words that the CFP uses, such established and entrenched norms which control hegemonic social understandings of disability and have constricting effects, restrictive effects on the lives of persons with disabilities. From play, okay, that is unstructured protest, that is how I use the word initially, to deviance and to conscious contestation, there are a wide range of ways in which resistance is manifested. And academic approaches to resistance take off from critical strategies to oppose power hierarchies, which range from Marxism and feminism on the one hand to post-colonialism, postmodernism on the other, all with the stated objective of transforming policies and institutions that create and maintain privilege for some and marginalize certain others. Now, against this brief background, let me now state that, in today's times, and as life enters art and disrupts the traditional boundaries that till now policed the distinction between life and art, the differences between the two are blurred, okay, in the postmodern context. And therefore, the conventional ways of making meaning have been problematized. And I think in all the three papers, we saw that the recent ways in which we talk of performance on stage and performance of identities in the same breath, they become a case in point. Talking of today's session and of the three papers presented, the fourth one was, of course, a more general take on disability. So in terms of the three papers which talk specifically about performance, the focus area for today's session, I think we can say that all three presenters, what they tried to do was to approach disability as performance in two broad ways: disability in performance and disability as performance. Okay. And when we talk of disability in performance, as I think Suman did, and also Asijit did in the third presentation, what we are basically looking at is to historicize the intersectional area between disability and performance, which I think Suman did excellently, to critique existing ways of representing disability in performance, okay, which I think both Suman and Jaya did, and also to review existing ways of representing both normativity and disability. And also, I think we are also talking, we should be talking, we haven't, in these three papers, about enabling performers and audience through various accessible practices. What I was looking for in Asijit's paper, and because you said that you are a practicing theater person, one which I am also, okay, is, while you raised very interesting questions about disability representation in productions, okay, I was expecting a bit more from you about the performative part, the choice of the performer, how, the disability of the performer or the lack of disability of the performer, corresponds to or relates to the character, and whether at all, disability representation should be there in theater. If yes, why? If not, why? But I think, to be fair to you, your paper was more about a close analysis of the text than about performance. But all in all,
I wanted to say a little. I wanted to say that the topics you
yes,
just raised, but the time
yes,
constraint was
yes,
really a problem. But yeah, I completely understand.
Yes, because as a fellow theater person, I think these are the first things that come to mind,
Absolutely,
right?
absolutely.
So how are we going to do it, and why are we going to do it the way we are?
Mm-hmm.
So, but anyway, four very enriching papers, of which three were related directly to the theme, and I think all three presenters showed their immense range, their understanding, and also their grasp of theoretical issues, and left us enriched with their presentations. Thank you, presenters. Thank you to the sole person who raised a query, Shilpa, in absentia. And thank you, organizers, for this very thoughtfully structured session, in which we began with disability in traditional performances, moved on to disability in the performance art, which is, how we effect a paradigm shift in disability representation, and of course then to a practicing theater person who actually, brought in all these questions in terms of what it means to represent disability on stage. Thank you all.
Thank you so much, Professor Mahanta, for being such a generous chair, and for also tying the entire conversation together. I think with that we come to the end of today's session, and